Right now, your mind is making decisions against you. Not because you are lazy, not because you are weak, but because your mind was trained to protect comfort instead of build strength. Every time you delay the hard conversation, every time you quit when emotions rise, every time you wait to feel ready, your mind learns that discomfort controls you. And if that pattern continues, your future will not be built by your goals. It will be built by your avoidance. This audiobook exists to stop that process. Not through motivation. Motivation disappears. This is mental conditioning. A complete rewiring of how you think, react, decide, and lead yourself under pressure. Tonight, you stop obeying emotion. Tonight, you begin training your mind to obey you. Your mind was never designed to make you happy. Most people spend their entire lives misunderstanding the purpose of their own mind. They believe the mind exists to help them succeed, to help them grow, to help them become disciplined, focused, confident, and powerful. But your mind was never designed for greatness. It was designed for survival. And survival has very different priorities than the future you say you want. Your mind does not naturally care about your goals. It cares about safety, comfort, energy conservation, immediate relief. That is why you procrastinate even when the task matters. That is why you avoid difficult conversations even when silence is destroying your relationships. That is why you reach for distraction the moment discomfort appears. Your mind protects comfort, not potential. That is the key. You need to understand this deeply because the moment you stop treating your destructive habits as personality flaws, you finally gain the power to change them. Most people think they are lazy, weak, undisciplined, broken. They are not broken. They are untrained. There is a difference. An untrained mind always chooses relief. Always. If stress appears, it looks for escape. If effort appears, it searches for comfort. If uncertainty appears, it moves towards safety. Not because you are defective. Because that is exactly what the human brain evolved to do. For thousands of years, survival depended on conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risk. The brain learned one rule above all others. If something feels uncomfortable, avoid it. That rule kept human beings alive in dangerous environments. But now, that same survival system quietly destroys modern lives. Because growth requires the exact opposite behavior. Growth requires discomfort, effort, risk, uncertainty, delayed gratification. And your mind resists all of it automatically. That is why you say you want change while continuing the same patterns every day. You wake up motivated. Then resistance appears. Suddenly your phone becomes interesting. Your room needs cleaning. You need coffee first. You'll start tomorrow. An untrained mind always chooses relief. That phrase will follow you through this entire audiobook because it explains almost every self-destructive behavior people struggle with. Procrastination is relief. Scrolling is relief. Avoidance is relief. Excuses are relief. Temporary emotional relief becomes more important than long-term transformation. And slowly, without realizing it, people build identities around avoidance. They become someone who delays, someone who quits, someone who starts over constantly, someone who waits to feel ready. But readiness rarely comes first. Action comes first. That is the truth most people never learn. Look carefully at your own life. Think about the conversations you avoided because they felt uncomfortable. Think about the opportunities you delayed because fear appeared. Think about how many nights disappeared into endless scrolling because your mind wanted easy dopamine instead of difficult growth. Your mind protects comfort, not potential. You have a choice. That choice begins with awareness. Awareness is the first pillar of this entire audiobook, because you cannot change a pattern you do not notice. Most people move through life unconsciously. Emotion reacts. Behavior follows. The pattern repeats. No interruption. No awareness. No leadership. Someone criticizes them and anger takes control. Stress appears and distraction takes control. Fear appears and avoidance takes control. The mind reacts automatically. Awareness interrupts that automation. Awareness means catching yourself in the moment. You notice the impulse to escape. You notice the urge to procrastinate. You notice the emotional pull toward comfort. And for the first time, instead of unconsciously obeying it, you observe it. That observation changes everything. Because awareness creates space. And space creates choice. That's the key. Without awareness, your mind runs your life automatically. With awareness, you begin reclaiming authority. But awareness alone is not enough. The second pillar is the pause. The pause is the moment between emotion and action. Tiny. Almost invisible. But powerful enough to completely alter your future. Right now, most of your behaviors happen too quickly for conscious choice. Emotion rises. Reaction follows. Stress appears. You grab your phone. Fear appears. You avoid the task. Anger appears. You say something destructive. No pause. No interruption. No leadership. The pause changes that. 1 breath. 3 seconds. A moment of deliberate interruption. That is where self-control begins. Not in motivation. Not in inspiration. In interruption. You have a choice. The third pillar is discipline. And discipline is often misunderstood. People think discipline means intensity, perfection, harshness. No. Discipline is simply refusing to negotiate with the behaviors that matter. That's all it is. You do what needs to be done whether your emotions approve or not. Because emotions change constantly. Standards do not. Motivation says, I'll do it when I feel ready. Discipline says, do it anyway. That difference changes entire lives. An untrained mind always chooses relief. A disciplined mind chooses direction. The fourth pillar is discomfort. Most people spend their lives avoiding discomfort without realizing that discomfort is the doorway to every meaningful transformation they want. Confidence is built through uncomfortable action. Strength is built through uncomfortable repetition. Growth is built through uncomfortable honesty. You cannot become powerful while remaining addicted to comfort. That is impossible. And this is exactly why modern distraction is so dangerous. Because distraction removes discomfort instantly. Bored? Scroll. Stressed? Escape. Anxious? Numb yourself. Lonely? Consume stimulation. The brain becomes conditioned to avoid stillness at all costs. But growth lives inside stillness. Inside effort. Inside discomfort. You have a choice. The fifth pillar is repetition. Because your identity is not created by intentions. It is created by repeated behavior. What you repeat, you become. If you repeatedly avoid difficulty, you become someone controlled by avoidance. If you repeatedly act despite discomfort, you become someone capable under pressure. Identity is trained through repetition, not through affirmations. not through motivation videos, not through wishing, through behavior, repeated behavior. That is why small actions matter so much. One difficult conversation, one completed task, one moment where you resist distraction, one moment where you pause instead of reacting emotionally. These moments seem insignificant, but repeated daily, they rebuild the architecture of your mind. Slowly, quietly, powerfully, and eventually something changes. You stop seeing yourself as someone who constantly loses control. You stop identifying as weak. You stop waiting for emotional permission to act. You become someone who leads yourself deliberately. That is the goal of this audiobook. Not perfection. Leadership. Inner leadership. Because your mind was never designed to automatically build the future you want. It was designed to seek comfort. And if you do not train it consciously, comfort will quietly become your identity. An untrained mind always chooses relief. But training changes everything. Awareness, plus discipline, discomfort, repetition, identity. These are the foundations. Master them and your entire life begins to change from the inside out. You are not fighting yourself. You are training yourself. That distinction matters. You have a choice. Now let's go deeper. Because once you understand that your mind protects comfort instead of potential, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when emotions start giving orders? Stop obeying every emotion you feel. Most people do not realize how much of their life is controlled by emotion, not logic, not discipline, not conscious decision-making. Emotion. A feeling appears and behavior follows automatically. Anger appears so they attack. Fear appears so they retreat. Stress appears so they escape. Sadness appears so they disconnect. No pause. No evaluation. No leadership. Just reaction. And because this happens so quickly, people assume it is natural. They assume emotions are supposed to control behavior. They are not. Emotions are signals, not commands. That distinction changes everything. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. That is the principle you must begin training into your nervous system starting today. Because right now, many of your worst decisions are not coming from conscious thought. They are coming from temporary emotional states that were never meant to lead your life. Think carefully about how many problems in your life began with emotional reaction. The angry message sent too quickly. The impulsive purchase made during stress. The relationship destroyed during emotional intensity. The opportunity abandoned because fear appeared. The routine quit because discomfort arrived. Emotion made the decision. And afterward, when the emotional wave passed, you were left dealing with the consequences. That is the cost of emotional obedience. You have a choice. Most people confuse emotion with truth. If they feel anxious, they assume something is wrong. If they feel insecure, they assume they are incapable. If they feel discomfort, they assume they should stop. But feelings are not facts. That's the key. A feeling is simply information. Fear says, something feels uncertain. Anger says, something feels threatened. Sadness says, something feels painful. Anxiety says, something feels unstable. Useful information, but terrible leadership. Because emotions were designed for survival, not accuracy. Fear exaggerates danger. Anger exaggerates offense. Anxiety exaggerates risk. And if you automatically obey every emotional signal, your life becomes controlled by temporary internal weather. One difficult emotion can completely redirect your future. That is why emotional control is not optional. It is survival in the modern world. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. Say that to yourself again. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. This does not mean becoming emotionless. That is a misunderstanding weak people often make about strength. Strength is not numbness. Strength is leadership. The strongest people still feel fear, still feel anger, still feel sadness, but they do not surrender authority to those emotions. That is the difference. A weak mind says, I feel fear, so I must retreat. A trained mind says, I feel fear, but I can still move forward. A weak mind says, I feel discomfort, so I should stop. A trained mind says, I feel discomfort and I continue anyway. That is emotional separation. And emotional separation is one of the most important skills you will ever build. Because the moment you separate feeling from action, you reclaim control over your life. Right now, most people are fused with their emotions. They become the emotion. Anger arrives and they become anger. Stress arrives and they become stress. Fear arrives and they become fear. No separation. No awareness. Just total identification with the emotional state. But you are not your emotions. You are the observer of them. That is the key. The emotion exists, but so do you, separately. That single shift changes your entire internal world. Now let's make this practical. Imagine someone sends you a disrespectful message. Immediately anger rises. Heart rate increases. The nervous system activates. The untrained mind reacts instantly. Aggressive response. Emotional attack. Long paragraph. Regret later. That reaction feels powerful in the moment. But it is weakness disguised as strength. Because emotional reaction is easy. Anyone can lose control. Real strength is restraint. Real strength is pausing long enough to decide whether the emotion deserves action. You have a choice. The same thing happens with panic decisions. A setback happens financially. Fear appears. Suddenly people make desperate choices. Quit too early. Sell too quickly. Abandon long-term plans for short-term relief. Emotion compresses time. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels catastrophic. Everything feels permanent. But emotions lie about permanence. Most emotional states fade if you stop feeding them with reaction. That's the key. Anxiety says, escape immediately. But if you stay present long enough, the intensity often decreases on its own. Anger says, respond now. But if you pause, clarity returns. Sadness says, withdraw completely. But if you continue moving deliberately, emotional momentum shifts. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. This principle applies everywhere. Emotional spending, impulse purchases, comfort eating, stress scrolling, addictive behaviors. Most of these are not logical decisions. They are emotional escape routes, temporary relief. An untrained mind always chooses relief. That is why emotional regulation matters so much. Because modern life constantly offers instant escape from discomfort. You feel stress? Open your phone. You feel boredom? Consume stimulation. You feel insecurity? Buy something. You feel pain? Distract yourself immediately. And slowly your brain becomes conditioned to obey emotion automatically. That conditioning weakens your ability to tolerate discomfort. And without discomfort tolerance, discipline collapses. You have a choice. Here is what emotional leadership actually looks like in practice. First, you notice the emotion, not after the reaction. During it, you catch the activation early, the tension in your chest, the tightening in your jaw, the urge to escape, the emotional pressure building. That awareness matters, because awareness interrupts automation. Second, you name the emotion clearly. This is anger. This is fear. This is anxiety. Not, I am angry, but anger is present. That language creates separation. You are no longer drowning inside the emotion. You are observing it. Third, you pause. 1 breath. 3 seconds. A deliberate interruption. Because emotions depend on speed. They want immediate obedience. The faster you react, the less conscious control exists. That is why slowing down is power. Fourth, you choose behavior based on values, not feelings. That is emotional maturity. Not, what do I feel like doing? But, what action aligns with the person I am trying to become? That question changes everything. Because emotions fluctuate constantly. Identity remains. And every moment you choose discipline over emotional impulse, you strengthen that identity. Slowly, quietly, powerfully. You become harder to manipulate, harder to provoke, harder to destabilize. Because your emotional system no longer controls your decisions automatically. And understand this clearly. The goal is not emotional suppression. Suppressed emotions eventually explode. The goal is emotional regulation. Feeling fully without surrendering leadership. That is strength. That is self-command. That is freedom. Feel everything. Obey nothing automatically. Most people never learn this. They spend their entire lives reacting emotionally and calling it personality. But personality is often just repeated emotional habit. And habits can be retrained. You have a choice. The next time fear appears, pause. The next time anger rises, breathe. The next time anxiety screams for escape, stay still long enough to observe it without obedience. Because every time you interrupt emotional automation, you train your mind to follow your direction instead of your impulses. And that training compounds. One pause at a time. One interruption at a time. One disciplined response at a time. Eventually something changes. You stop feeling controlled by every emotion that enters your body. You stop reacting automatically. You stop surrendering your future to temporary feelings. You begin leading yourself deliberately. And once you understand that emotions are signals instead of commands, the next step becomes unavoidable. If emotions lose authority, where does real control actually come from? Everything changes in the pause. Most people believe self-control is about willpower. It is not. Self-control is about interruption. The tiny interruption between feeling something and acting on it. That interruption is called the pause. And the pause is where power lives. That is the key. Right now, most people do not live from conscious choice. They live from emotional momentum. Something happens. Emotion rises. Reaction follows instantly. No space. No awareness. No leadership. Just automatic behavior. Someone criticizes them. They explode. Stress appears at work. They panic. An argument begins in a relationship. They say something destructive. An uncomfortable feeling appears. They grab their phone, food, alcohol, distraction, stimulation. Reaction becomes automatic. And every time this happens, the brain learns something dangerous. Emotions control behavior. That conditioning quietly becomes identity. But the moment you build the pause, the entire structure begins to change. Because the pause interrupts emotional authority. The pause is where power lives. Understand this clearly. The pause does not need to be dramatic. It is not an hour of meditation. Not a perfect state of enlightenment. Sometimes it is 3 seconds. 3 seconds before speaking. 3 seconds before replying. 3 seconds before quitting. 3 seconds before reacting emotionally. That tiny space changes entire lives. You have a choice. Without the pause, emotions own your behavior. With a pause, you reclaim direction. That is why emotional mastery is impossible without slowing down. Because emotions depend on speed. Anger wants immediate reaction. Fear wants immediate escape. Anxiety wants immediate certainty. Stress wants immediate relief. Urgency is the emotional system's strategy for bypassing conscious thought. That's the key. The faster you react, the less awareness exists. The slower you become, the more control becomes available. This is why powerful people move differently under pressure. Not because they feel less emotion. Because they pause inside the emotion. That difference matters. Most people think calm individuals are naturally calm. No, they train the pause. They train themselves not to react immediately. That training changed their nervous system. And you can train it too. The pause is where power lives. Now let's make this practical. Imagine you are in an argument. Someone says something disrespectful. Immediately your body changes. Heart rate increases. Breathing shortens. Muscles tighten. Thoughts accelerate. The emotional system is preparing for reaction. The untrained mind reacts instantly. Louder voice. Aggressive tone. Defensive energy. Emotional attack. And afterward? Regret. Because emotional reactions solve very little. They usually create additional damage. That is why silence is strength. Weak people think silence means losing. Weak people think immediate reaction means power. It does not. Real power is restraint. Real power is the ability to remain grounded while emotion is demanding action. That is rare. And rarity creates strength. You have a choice. The next time conflict appears, pause before speaking. One breath. Not because the emotion disappears. Because the pause keeps the emotion from taking control. That breath matters more than most people realize. Breathing is not just relaxation. It is interruption. When emotions rise, breathing becomes shallow and fast. The body prepares for survival. But one slow breath signals something different to the nervous system. Immediate reaction is not necessary. That single interruption creates space for awareness to return. The pause is where power lives. The same principle applies at work. Stress builds. Pressure increases. Emails pile up. Deadlines approach. The untrained mind spirals emotionally. Panic. Overthinking. Emotional exhaustion. Impulsive decisions. But stress is not what destroys performance. Reactive stress is what destroys performance. That's the key. The problem is not pressure. The problem is emotional acceleration inside pressure. This is why slowing physical momentum matters so much. When stress rises, slow your breathing. Slow your speech. Slow your movements. Slow your reactions. Because physical speed amplifies emotional speed. And emotional speed destroys clarity. Powerful people understand this instinctively. They do not rush emotionally. They remain deliberate. Not passive. Not weak. Deliberate. That difference changes outcomes. The pause is where power lives. Now think about relationship conflict. Most relationships are not destroyed by problems. They are destroyed by emotional reactions during problems. The sarcastic comment, the defensive tone, the impulsive accusation, the emotional withdrawal. Reaction creates escalation. Escalation destroys trust. And most of that destruction could have been prevented with one skill: the pause. You do not need to solve the entire conflict immediately. You do not need to respond the second emotion appears. You do not need their permission to slow down. That is strength. The pause allows you to ask, what response actually aligns with the person I want to become? That question changes everything. Because emotionally reactive people only ask, what do I feel right now? Emotionally disciplined people ask, what creates the best long-term outcome? That is maturity. That is leadership. That is self-command. You have a choice. Now let's talk about impulse behavior. Because most destructive habits happen without pause. Scrolling, emotional eating, impulse spending, pornography, addictive stimulation, comfort behaviors. The pattern is always the same. Emotion appears. Impulse follows. Behavior happens automatically. No interruption. That is why the pause matters so much in addiction and distraction. Because the pause weakens impulsive momentum. Imagine reaching for your phone automatically. Instead of grabbing it instantly, pause. One breath. Notice the urge. Notice the discomfort underneath it. Notice the emotional need driving the behavior. Boredom, stress, loneliness, anxiety. Now something important happens. You are no longer unconscious. You are observing the behavior before participating in it. That awareness weakens the impulse immediately. That's the key. Most impulses depend on unconscious speed. Slow them down and they lose power. This is why delayed reaction is one of the strongest forms of self-discipline in existence. Not because delay feels good. It often feels uncomfortable. The emotional system hates waiting. It wants immediate relief, immediate certainty, immediate reaction. But growth happens inside delayed gratification, inside delayed reaction, inside the pause. The pause is where power lives. At first, this training feels unnatural. Your mind will resist it, will tell you, react now, escape now, say something, do something. Because the old conditioning wants speed. That resistance is normal. Do not interpret discomfort as failure. It's not about comfort. It's about discipline. Every time you pause instead of reacting automatically, you strengthen a new pattern, a new identity. The identity of someone who leads themselves deliberately. And eventually something changes. The pause becomes more natural. Reaction slows down. Clarity returns faster. Emotional intensity loses authority. Not because emotions disappear. Because awareness becomes stronger than impulse. That is emotional mastery. Not perfection. Not suppression. Leadership. You begin realizing that most of your life changes not in giant dramatic moments, but in tiny pauses nobody else can see. One breath before speaking. One moment before reacting. One interruption before surrendering to impulse. That is where your future changes. The pause is where power lives. And once you understand how powerful interruption truly is, the next challenge becomes unavoidable. What happens when motivation disappears completely? Because eventually it will. And when it does, only one thing remains. Motivation is a trap. Most people are addicted to motivation. That is the problem. They wait to feel inspired before they act. They wait to feel confident before they begin. They wait to feel energized before they commit. And because emotions constantly change, their behavior constantly changes with them. One day they feel unstoppable. The next day they disappear completely. That is not discipline. That is emotional dependence. Motivation starts. Discipline continues. That is the truth most people spend years avoiding. Because motivation feels powerful. It creates excitement, energy, possibility, momentum. In those moments, change feels easy. You tell yourself, this time will be different. You plan the workout routine, the business launch, the study schedule, the content strategy, the new habits, and for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, you feel incredible. Then reality arrives. Fatigue appears. Stress appears. Boredom appears. Resistance appears. And suddenly the emotional state that created the motivation disappears. Now what happens? Most people stop. Because they were never committed to discipline. They were committed to emotion. That's the key. Motivated people act when they feel like it. Disciplined people act because they decided it matters. That difference changes entire lives. Motivation starts. Discipline continues. Look carefully at the patterns in your life. How many times have you started something with excitement, only to abandon it once it stopped feeling exciting? The gym, the diet, the business idea, the YouTube channel, the studying routine, the morning habits. This is why motivation is dangerous. Not because motivation is bad. Because motivation is temporary. And temporary emotions cannot be trusted to build permanent results. You have a choice. Most people think successful individuals feel motivated all the time. They do not. The disciplined athlete does not always feel motivated to train. The successful entrepreneur does not always feel motivated to work. The creator does not always feel inspired to create. They simply stopped allowing emotion to determine action. That is the real difference. The untrained mind asks, how do I feel today? The trained mind asks, what did I commit to? That shift changes everything. Because emotional productivity is unstable. Some days you feel powerful. Some days you feel weak. If your behavior changes every time your emotions change, consistency becomes impossible. And without consistency, growth collapses. That's the key. Results are not created by intensity. They are created by repetition. Small actions repeated consistently. That is why discipline always defeats motivation long term. Motivation creates peaks. Discipline creates baseline. Peaks feel exciting. Baselines create transformation. Now think about the gym. This is where most people misunderstand progress completely. Motivated people work out hard when emotions are high. They train aggressively for a week, then disappear for 3 weeks. Why? Because they built the routine on emotional energy instead of identity. Disciplined people operate differently. They remove emotion from the equation. They train because training is what they do, not because they feel inspired, not because motivation appeared, because the behavior became non-negotiable. That's the key. Discipline is not intensity. Discipline is consistency without emotional negotiation. You wake up. You do the work, regardless of mood. That identity changes the entire relationship with effort. The same principle applies to waking up early. Most people fail because every morning becomes a negotiation. The alarm rings. The mind begins bargaining immediately. You deserve more sleep. You can start tomorrow. One day won't matter. And because the decision is still emotional, comfort wins. An untrained mind always chooses relief. But disciplined people decide in advance. No negotiation. No emotional debate. No daily reconsideration. The decision was already made. That removes friction. Because constant decision-making drains mental energy. That's why systems matter more than feelings. Motivation relies on emotion. Discipline relies on structure. You have a choice. Now think about studying. Most students do not fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they study emotionally. When motivation exists, they work intensely. When motivation disappears, they stop completely. This creates inconsistency. And inconsistency destroys momentum. Disciplined people study differently. They build systems, specific times, specific environments, specific expectations. They do not ask, "Do I feel like studying?" They ask, "What does the system require?" That question matters enormously, because identity-based systems outperform emotional energy every single time. That is true in business too, especially business. Most people romanticize entrepreneurship because they only imagine the motivated moments, the vision, the excitement, the potential. But business success is built in repetition, showing up when nobody cares, creating when inspiration disappears, continuing when growth is invisible, working when emotional rewards are absent. That is where discipline separates people permanently. Because motivation cannot survive long periods without emotional reward. Discipline can. That's the key. Content creation is another perfect example. Most people create emotionally. They post when they feel confident. They disappear when engagement drops. They stop when insecurity appears. Their emotional state controls consistency. But the creators who succeed long-term understand something different. Consistency creates identity. Identity creates trust. And trust compounds over time. That only happens through disciplined repetition. Not emotional excitement. Not temporary inspiration. Repetition. Motivation starts. Discipline continues. Understand this deeply. Discipline is not punishment. People misunderstand that completely. Discipline is self-respect expressed through behavior. It is keeping promises to yourself even when emotions resist them. That changes how you see yourself. Every time you follow through despite resistance, your identity strengthens. You begin trusting yourself. Not because you feel confident all the time. Because your behavior proves reliability. That is real confidence. Not loud emotion. Not temporary hype. Evidence. Evidence built through disciplined action. And slowly something changes internally. The mind stops arguing as much. Because it learns emotional resistance no longer changes outcomes. At first, Discipline feels difficult because the emotional system still believes negotiation works. But when you repeatedly act despite resistance, the mind adapts. The excuses weaken. The bargaining decreases. The hesitation shortens. Not because the work became easier, because your identity became stronger. That's the key. You stop experiencing yourself as someone trying to become disciplined. You become someone who simply follows through. That identity shift changes everything. It changes how you approach discomfort, how you approach effort, how you approach stress. Because disciplined people do not rely on emotion to carry them forward. They rely on standards. Standards survive emotional fluctuation. That is why discipline creates freedom while emotional dependence creates instability. You have a choice. Right now, stop asking, how motivated do I feel? Start asking, what kind of person am I training myself to become? That question creates different behavior immediately. Because identity-based action outlasts emotional states. And every day you continue despite resistance, despite boredom, despite lack of motivation, you strengthen the internal architecture of self-command. That architecture compounds, quietly, slowly, powerfully, until one day you realize something important. You no longer need motivation to move forward. You trained yourself to continue anyway. And once you stop depending on motivation, the next lesson becomes unavoidable. If discipline matters more than feelings, then discomfort itself becomes the training ground for transformation. Train yourself to do hard things daily. Most people are waiting to feel ready. That is why they stay stuck. They believe confidence comes first, then action follows. But that is backwards. Confidence is built after difficult action, not before it. Action creates readiness. That is the key. Right now, there are people delaying their future because they are waiting for a feeling that never arrives naturally. They want to start the business, but they do not feel confident enough. They want to go to the gym, but they do not feel motivated enough. They want to speak up, but they do not feel ready enough. So they wait. And while they wait, avoidance becomes identity. That is how weakness is trained. Not through dramatic failure. Through repeated retreat from discomfort. Every time you avoid something difficult, your mind learns a dangerous lesson. Discomfort should be escaped. And the more you repeat that pattern, the weaker your tolerance for difficulty becomes. That's the key. Avoidance trains weakness. Engagement trains strength. You have a choice. Most people think weakness is a personality trait. It is not. Weakness is often just practiced avoidance. The person who cannot handle confrontation usually avoided difficult conversations repeatedly. The person who lacks discipline usually escaped discomfort repeatedly. The person who struggles with confidence usually stopped acting whenever fear appeared. These patterns compound over time. And eventually, people mistake conditioning for identity. They say, this is just who I am. No, this is what you practiced. And practice can be changed. Action creates readiness. Understand something important. The mind learns through behavior, not intention. You do not become stronger by thinking about strength. You become stronger by moving through resistance repeatedly. That is why hard things matter so much. Not because suffering itself is valuable. Because difficult action retrains your relationship with discomfort. And once your relationship with discomfort changes, your entire life changes with it. Most people organize their lives around comfort. Comfortable conversations. comfortable routines, comfortable environments, comfortable behaviors. But comfort rarely produces transformation. Comfort preserves the current version of you. Growth requires friction. That's the key. Now think about delayed work. One task, one uncomfortable responsibility. Immediately the emotional system resists it. The work feels overwhelming, boring, stressful. So the mind searches for relief. Phone, scrolling, snacking, cleaning, anything except the difficult thing itself. That avoidance creates temporary comfort. But temporary comfort creates long-term weakness. Because every time you escape effort, you train your brain to believe effort is dangerous. And eventually, even small tasks begin feeling emotionally heavy. This is how procrastination becomes identity. Not because people are lazy, because they repeatedly trained escape. Action creates readiness. The cure is not more motivation. The cure is deliberate engagement with discomfort. You sit down and begin the work before you feel emotionally prepared. That matters enormously, because readiness rarely arrives before action. Readiness is created through action. You have a choice. The same thing happens with rejection. Most people fear rejection so deeply that they organize their entire lives around avoiding it. They do not speak honestly, do not take risks, do not approach opportunities, do not express interest, do not create publicly. Why? Because rejection feels emotionally painful. So avoidance becomes protection. But avoidance also becomes limitation. Every avoided risk quietly shrinks your world. And the longer you avoid discomfort, the more powerful the fear becomes. That's the key. Fear grows through avoidance. Strength grows through exposure. This is why difficult action must become daily training, not occasional, daily. Because your nervous system adapts to what you repeatedly expose it to. If you expose yourself constantly to comfort, your tolerance for discomfort weakens. If you expose yourself consistently to challenge, your capacity expands. That is how mental toughness is built. Not through speeches, through repetition under discomfort. Action creates readiness. This is why deliberate discomfort training matters so much. You must stop treating discomfort like an emergency. Instead, begin treating it like training. Hard workouts teach your mind to continue under resistance. Cold environments teach your nervous system to stay calm under stress. Focused work trains your attention to resist distraction. Uncomfortable honesty trains courage. Finishing tasks without stimulation trains discipline. Every difficult action sends the same message to your brain. Discomfort does not control me. That message changes identity. Now let's talk about hard workouts specifically. Most people think exercise is only physical. It is not. Physical training is emotional training. Every workout contains resistance, fatigue, discomfort, pressure. And every time you continue despite that discomfort, you strengthen your relationship with challenge itself. That is why disciplined physical training often changes every other area of life. Because the mind learns, I can continue even when I feel resistance. That lesson transfers everywhere. Business, relationships, focus, stress, self-control. The same principle applies to cold environments. Cold water shocks the nervous system. The body wants escape immediately. But when you remain calm inside discomfort instead of reacting automatically, something important happens. You interrupt panic conditioning. You teach yourself, Intensity is not emergency. That lesson is powerful far beyond the cold itself. Because life constantly creates emotional intensity. And the trained mind learns not to collapse every time discomfort appears. That's the key. Now think about focused work. Deep focus has become rare because modern people are addicted to interruption. The moment boredom appears, they escape. The moment effort increases, they check notifications. The moment attention becomes uncomfortable, they seek stimulation. That pattern destroys mental endurance. Focus is not about intelligence. It is about discomfort tolerance. Because sustained concentration feels uncomfortable at first. The brain wants novelty, movement, dopamine. But disciplined focus retrains attention. You stay with the task. You resist the urge to escape. You finish what you started. That is emotional training disguised as productivity. Action creates readiness. Now let's talk about uncomfortable honesty. Most people lie constantly in small ways to avoid discomfort. They avoid difficult truths, hide real feelings, pretend agreement, suppress boundaries, not because they are malicious, because honesty creates emotional risk. But every avoided truth weakens self-respect. That is why courage matters. Not dramatic courage, daily courage. The courage to speak clearly, the courage to say no, the courage to disappoint people when necessary. You do not need their permission to live honestly. That is strength. You have a choice. Finally, learn to finish things without distraction. This matters more than most people realize. Because modern distraction is emotional escape disguised as entertainment. Every unfinished task trains inconsistency. Every interruption trains scattered attention. Every escape from effort weakens discipline. So begin training completion. Finish the workout. Finish the task. Finish the difficult conversation. Finish what you start. Not perfectly. Consistently. That repetition changes identity. Slowly, your mind begins understanding something new. Discomfort is survivable. Resistance is temporary. Effort is not danger. And eventually, hard things stop feeling impossible. Not because life became easier, because you became stronger. Action creates readiness. Remember this clearly. You do not become confident before difficult action. You become confident because of difficult action repeated consistently over time. That is how strength is built. That is how discipline is built. That is how identity changes permanently. And once you understand that difficult action transforms your relationship with discomfort, the next challenge becomes unavoidable. If discomfort no longer controls you, then what about the thoughts inside your own mind? You are not your thoughts. Most people spend their entire lives trapped inside their own thinking. Not because their thoughts are true, because they never learned how to separate themselves from the voice inside their head. A thought appears and immediately becomes identity. I'm not good enough. This will fail. Something is wrong with me. I always ruin everything. The mind says it, and people believe it automatically. No awareness, no observation, no separation. That is where suffering multiplies. Because thoughts are mental events, not truth, not commands, not identity. You are the observer, not the voice. That is the key. Right now, there is a constant stream of internal dialogue running through your mind. Thousands of thoughts every single day. Some useful, some irrational, some repetitive, some destructive. But the untrained mind treats every thought like reality, and that creates emotional chaos. One insecure thought becomes anxiety. One fearful thought becomes avoidance. One self-critical thought becomes shame. Thoughts trigger emotion. Emotion strengthens thoughts. The cycle feeds itself. That is how mental spirals are created. You have a choice. Most people think the solution is positive thinking. It is not. Trying to force positivity against negative thinking often creates more mental conflict, because now you are fighting the thought directly. And whatever receives emotional energy tends to grow stronger. That's the key. The goal is not controlling every thought. The goal is changing your relationship with thought itself. You are the observer, not the voice. That distinction changes everything. Imagine sitting beside a river. Thoughts are the water moving past you. The untrained mind jumps into the river and gets carried away by every current. Fear, self-doubt, overthinking, shame, catastrophic imagination. The trained mind stays on the shore, observing. The thoughts still exist, but they no longer control direction automatically. That is mental freedom. Now let's talk about self-doubt. Self-doubt destroys more potential than failure ever will. Not because doubt itself is dangerous, because people obey it automatically. A thought appears. You're not capable. Immediately behavior changes. Effort decreases. Risk disappears. Action stops. The person reacts to the thought as if it were objective truth. But thoughts are often just conditioned mental patterns repeated over time. That's the key. The mind repeats familiar narratives whether they are accurate or not. If you spent years criticizing yourself internally, those thoughts become automatic. Not because they are true, because repetition trained them into your nervous system. And repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates belief. But familiarity is not truth. You have a choice. The next time self-doubt appears, stop identifying with it immediately. Instead of saying, "I am not capable," shift the language. A thought about inadequacy is present. That sounds small. It is not small. That shift creates separation. You are no longer fused with the thought. You are observing the thought. You are the observer, not the voice. Now let's talk about overthinking. Overthinking is not intelligence. Most overthinking is fear searching for certainty. The mind keeps replaying scenarios because it believes enough thinking will eliminate risk completely. But life does not offer complete certainty. So the mind loops endlessly. What if this goes wrong? What if they reject me? What if I fail? What if I embarrass myself? The spiral continues. Not because thinking is solving the problem. Because thinking temporarily creates the illusion of control. That's the key. Overthinking often feels productive while quietly preventing action. And the longer you stay trapped inside thought loops, the more emotionally convincing they become. The solution is not endless mental debate. The solution is observation without engagement. Notice the thought. Do not argue with it. Do not chase it. Do not build an entire emotional future around it. Observe it. Then return to the present moment. That is discipline. You have a choice. Now consider catastrophic thinking. This is where the mind takes uncertainty and turns it into disaster. A delayed text becomes rejection. A mistake becomes total failure. A difficult moment becomes permanent destruction. The emotional system exaggerates danger automatically. That is what survival-oriented minds do. But catastrophic thinking destroys calm because the nervous system reacts to imagined threats as if they are real. The body tightens, stress increases, fear escalates, and suddenly you are emotionally reacting to events that have not even happened. That is why awareness matters so much. Because awareness interrupts mental exaggeration. Instead of automatically believing the thought, pause and ask, is this reality or emotional prediction? That question weakens the spiral immediately. That's the key. Most catastrophic thoughts collapse under observation. Now let's talk about shame loops. This is one of the most destructive mental patterns people carry. A mistake happens. Immediately the mind creates identity from the event. Not, I made a mistake, but I am a failure. That shift is devastating, because shame attacks identity instead of behavior. And once identity feels damaged, motivation collapses. People stop trying, stop acting, stop believing change is possible. But shame is rarely productive. Shame traps people in emotional paralysis. Responsibility creates change. Shame creates stagnation. That's the key. You do not need to hate yourself to improve yourself. You need awareness, honesty, discipline. You have a choice. Now let's make this practical. How do you actually detach from thought? First, begin naming thoughts, not emotionally reacting to them. Naming them. This is fear. This is self-doubt. This is catastrophic thinking. This is insecurity. That simple act creates observation, and observation weakens identification. Second, watch recurring mental patterns. Notice which thoughts appear repeatedly under stress. The mind often reuses the same stories. You're behind. You'll fail. You're not enough. These thoughts are often conditioned loops. Seeing the pattern reduces its power, because now you recognize this is the same old narrative, not objective reality. Third, stop arguing internally with every thought. This is important. The mind loves conflict. The more emotionally you fight thoughts, the more attention you feed them. Instead, practice allowing thoughts to exist without obedience. A thought appears. You notice it. You let it pass. No panic. No internal war. That is emotional maturity. You are the observer, not the voice. Finally, return to awareness repeatedly. Return to your breathing, your environment, your body, the present moment. Because awareness grounds you in reality while thought spirals pull you into imagined futures and distorted narratives. The present moment is where clarity lives, not inside endless mental noise. You have a choice. Remember this clearly. Your mind will continue producing thoughts. That is what minds do. The goal is not silence. The goal is leadership. You stop treating every thought like a command. You stop building identity around temporary mental events. You stop surrendering behavior to internal noise. And slowly something changes. Thoughts lose authority. Overthinking weakens. Mental spirals shorten. Awareness strengthens. Not because difficult thoughts disappear. Because you finally understand something powerful. You are the observer, not the voice. And once you stop being controlled by every thought in your head, the next transformation becomes possible. Learning how to remain calm even when pressure rises around you. Calm is a skill, not a personality trait. Most people misunderstand calm completely. They think calm is personality. genetics, natural temperament. They believe some people are simply born emotionally stable while others are destined to live overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, and reactivity. That belief is false. Calm is trained under pressure. That is the key. Calm is not something you are born with. It is something you practice. And like every other skill, it strengthens through repetition. Right now, many people are living inside a permanently activated nervous system. Constant stimulation, constant urgency, constant emotional escalation. Their body never fully relaxes. Breathing stays shallow. Shoulders stay tense. Thoughts stay accelerated. The nervous system remains prepared for threat even when no immediate danger exists. That chronic activation slowly becomes normal. People get so used to internal chaos that calm begins to feel unfamiliar. But your body is always communicating with your mind. And when the nervous system stays activated, emotional control becomes much harder. That's the key. Most emotional reactions begin physically before they become mental. The body tightens first. The breath changes first. The nervous system activates first. Then thoughts accelerate afterward. That is why emotional mastery cannot happen through thought alone. You must train the body too. Calm is trained under pressure. Now understand something important. The nervous system interprets urgency as danger. That means when you move fast emotionally, the body assumes threat exists. Rapid speech, aggressive movement, shallow breathing, instant reaction. All of these reinforce activation. And activation creates emotional escalation. That is why slowing down is power. You have a choice. Think about what happens during stress. A difficult conversation begins. An unexpected problem appears. Conflict enters the room. Immediately the nervous system reacts. Heart rate rises. Breathing shortens. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. The body prepares for survival. This response is automatic. But what happens next is trainable. That is where calm is built. Not in peaceful moments. Under pressure. Calm is trained under pressure. Most people respond to activation unconsciously. They speed up. Speech becomes faster. Thoughts become louder. Emotion becomes stronger. And because the nervous system now believes emergency exists, the emotional state intensifies further. This is how people spiral. One emotion feeds the next. One reaction amplifies another. Until eventually they lose clarity completely. That is why awareness matters so much. You must catch activation early, not after the emotional explosion. During the buildup. That's the key. Notice the shallow breathing. Notice the tension in your jaw. Notice the tightening in your chest. Notice the urge to react immediately. Those are signals. Signals that the nervous system is entering survival mode. And survival mode destroys deliberate thinking. You have a choice. The first practical skill is posture. Most people do not realize how much posture affects emotional state. When stress rises, the body collapses inward automatically. Shoulders tighten. Neck stiffens. Spine compresses. That physical contraction signals threat to the nervous system. But posture works both ways. When you deliberately straighten the spine, relax the shoulders, unclench the jaw, the body begins communicating safety back to the brain. This matters enormously, because calm is not just mental, it is physiological. Your body and mind are constantly reinforcing each other. That's the key. Now let's talk about breathing. Breathing is one of the fastest ways to interrupt emotional escalation. Not because breathing magically removes stress, because breathing regulates nervous system activation. When emotions rise, breathing becomes shallow and rapid. That pattern signals urgency. But slow breathing sends the opposite message. Immediate danger is not present. One slow inhale, one controlled exhale. That single interruption creates space for awareness to return, and awareness changes behavior. The next time pressure rises, breathe before reacting. Not after the argument, before the reaction. That pause matters more than most people realize. Calm is trained under pressure. Now consider delayed speech. This skill alone can change relationships, careers, and entire futures. Most emotional damage happens through immediate speech. People say things during activation that clarity would never choose. Because emotions want release. And speech becomes emotional discharge. That is why disciplined silence is powerful. Not weak. Not passive. Powerful. Weak people react instantly because they cannot tolerate emotional tension. Strong people pause. They allow the emotion to settle before choosing words. That is emotional leadership. You do not need their permission to slow down. That's the key. The next time someone provokes you, resist the urge to answer immediately. Pause. Breathe. Let the nervous system stabilize before speaking. Because calm responses create better outcomes than emotional reactions almost every time. Now let's talk about controlled silence. Modern people are deeply uncomfortable with silence. Silence creates emotional exposure. So people fill space constantly. Explaining, defending, reacting, oversharing, emotionally talking themselves into worse states. But silence creates perspective. Silence interrupts escalation. Silence gives awareness room to operate. That is why calm individuals often appear powerful without saying much. Their nervous system is not rushing to eliminate emotional discomfort immediately. They can stay present without reacting automatically. That is strength. Calm is trained under pressure. Now think about slower reactions overall. Most emotional behavior is fast. Fast anger. Fast panic. Fast assumptions. Fast defensiveness. But slowness creates control. Slow breathing. Slow movement. Slow speech. Slow reaction. Slowing down prevents emotional momentum from taking over completely. That's the key. Speed belongs to impulse. Slowness belongs to awareness. This applies everywhere. Arguments, work stress, financial pressure, relationship conflict, unexpected setbacks. The trained mind slows down under pressure instead of speeding up emotionally. And that changes outcomes dramatically. Because clarity lives in calm, not in panic. You have a choice. Understand this clearly. Calm does not mean emotion disappears. Calm means emotion no longer controls behavior automatically. You still feel stress, still feel anger, still feel pressure. But the nervous system becomes more stable inside those experiences. That stability creates better decisions. And over time, repetition changes identity. The mind begins learning. Pressure is survivable. Discomfort is manageable. Urgency does not require immediate reaction. That retraining changes your entire emotional baseline. Slowly you become harder to provoke, harder to destabilize, harder to overwhelm. Not because life became easier, Because your nervous system became stronger. Calm is trained under pressure. Remember this. Anyone can appear calm when life feels easy. Real calm appears during conflict, during uncertainty, during emotional intensity. That is where the training reveals itself. And the more you practice regulation under pressure, the more natural steadiness becomes. Not forced calm. Real calm. The kind that changes how people experience your presence. The kind that changes how you experience yourself. And once you understand how to regulate your nervous system under pressure, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do your daily habits reveal about who is truly in control of your life? Your habits reveal who controls you. Most people believe identity is something internal. A mindset, a personality, a belief system. But identity is revealed through behavior, not intentions, not goals, not words. Behavior. Your habits expose who is really in control of your life. That's the key. Because every repeated action trains the nervous system toward a specific identity. Repeated discipline creates discipline. Repeated distraction creates distraction. Repeated avoidance creates weakness. Repeated focus creates control. What you repeat, you become. Read that again carefully. What you repeat, you become. Not occasionally. Repeatedly. That means your daily behaviors matter far more than your temporary motivation. Because habits shape identity quietly. Every single day, your actions are answering an important question. Are emotions controlling your behavior, or are standards controlling your behavior? Most people never ask themselves that question honestly, but the answer is visible everywhere in their life. You have a choice. Look at your mornings. The moment you wake up, your nervous system immediately reveals its conditioning. Most people begin the day reactively. Phone first. Notifications first. Stimulation first. Before awareness. Before intention. Before control. The mind immediately seeks dopamine, distraction, and emotional comfort. And that pattern matters more than people realize. Because the first actions of the day establish psychological momentum. If your day begins with distraction, impulsiveness, and reactive behavior, the nervous system carries that pattern forward. That's the key. Morning routines are not about perfection. They are about direction. The first hour of your day trains your mind how to operate for the rest of the day. Disciplined mornings build internal stability. Reactive mornings build mental chaos. And over time, repetition becomes identity. What you repeat, you become. Now let's talk about sleep discipline. This is one of the clearest examples of emotional behavior versus identity-based behavior. Most people know what supports their health, but emotions override standards constantly. Late night scrolling, endless stimulation, sleep procrastination. What? Because the emotional system wants immediate comfort more than long-term recovery. That is how emotional living destroys discipline quietly. One impulsive decision repeated nightly becomes chronic exhaustion. And exhausted people struggle to regulate emotions, maintain focus, and sustain discipline. Everything becomes harder. That's the key. Your habits either strengthen your nervous system or weaken it. Sleep is not just physical recovery. It is emotional recovery too. A disciplined person understands this. They stop negotiating endlessly with behaviors they already know are damaging them. That is maturity. Not knowing better. Following through consistently. You have a choice. Now consider focus control. Modern attention is under attack constantly. Notifications, videos, scrolling, infinite stimulation. Most people no longer control their attention. Their attention gets controlled for them. And wherever attention goes repeatedly, identity follows. A distracted mind becomes a distracted life. That's the key. People think focus is about productivity. It is deeper than that. Focus is about authority over your own mind. Can you stay with discomfort without escaping? Can you remain present without stimulation? Can you complete difficult tasks without emotional distraction? Most people cannot. Not because they are incapable, because they train distraction daily. Every interruption reinforces mental fragmentation. Every impulsive phone check weakens sustained attention. And eventually the nervous system becomes addicted to novelty. That addiction destroys depth. Depth of thinking. Depth of work. Depth of relationships. What you repeat, you become. Now let's talk directly about phone addiction. Because many people are no longer living consciously. They are living reactively through screens. Every uncomfortable emotion triggers the same response. Reach for the phone. Bored? Scroll. Lonely? Scroll. Anxious? Scroll. Overwhelmed? Scroll. The phone becomes emotional anesthesia. Not because technology is evil. Because unconscious usage trains dependency. And dependency weakens self-command. That's the key. Every time you automatically escape discomfort through stimulation, you reinforce the belief that stillness is intolerable. But stillness is where awareness grows. Stillness is where clarity returns. Stillness is where discipline strengthens. This is why intentional disconnection matters. Not permanently, deliberately. Moments without stimulation retrain the nervous system to tolerate presence again. You have a choice. Now think about emotional eating. Most people do not eat only from hunger. They eat emotionally. Stress eating, comfort eating, reward eating, escape eating. Food becomes regulation for emotional discomfort. Again, the pattern is the same. Emotion appears. Behavior follows automatically. No pause. No awareness. That is why emotional habits matter so much. Because the behavior itself is often less dangerous than the unconsciousness behind it. The real issue is automatic reaction. That's the key. Every compulsive habit reveals where emotional control is still weak. Not to shame you. To reveal what still needs training. You have a choice. Now consider distraction cycles overall. This is how many people live permanently. Stressed, distracted, overstimulated, emotionally reactive, mentally exhausted. Not because life is impossible. Because they never built standards stronger than emotion. Their routines depend on how they feel each day. And emotions fluctuate constantly. That means consistency disappears constantly too. But disciplined people live differently. They build non-negotiables. Non-negotiables are behaviors performed regardless of emotional state. That is where real identity change begins. Not when behavior feels easy. When behavior continues despite resistance. That's the key. A non-negotiable might be waking up on time, training daily, focused work sessions, no phone during specific hours, reading every night, keeping promises to yourself, finishing tasks before entertainment. The behavior becomes standard, not emotional preference. That difference changes everything. Because every time you follow through despite emotional resistance, your identity strengthens. You begin trusting yourself. And self-trust changes human behavior profoundly. Most people secretly do not trust themselves anymore. Why? Because they repeatedly break their own standards. Promises get abandoned. Goals get delayed. Commitments disappear under emotional pressure. That weakens identity internally. But every kept promise rebuilds self-respect. Slowly, quietly, powerfully. What you repeat, you become. Understand this clearly. Your life is not shaped primarily by dramatic moments. It is shaped by repeated patterns. Tiny repeated actions. Tiny repeated choices. Tiny repeated behaviors. And those behaviors either reinforce emotional dependence or strengthen disciplined identity. That is why habits matter so much. Not because routines are magical. Because repetition rewires identity. You become what you repeatedly practice. If you practice distraction, you become distracted. If you practice discipline, you become disciplined. If you practice avoidance, you become avoidant. If you practice self-command, you become stronger. You have a choice. Right now, stop asking, what do I want my life to become? Start asking, what behaviors am I repeating daily? Because the answer to that question reveals your future with brutal honesty. Not your intentions, your repetitions. What you repeat, you become. And once you understand how habits quietly shape identity, the next realization becomes unavoidable. If repeated action creates identity, then waiting to magically become someone else is one of the greatest traps of all. Stop waiting to become someone else. Most people are waiting for a future version of themselves to save them. A future version with more confidence, more discipline, more motivation, more courage, more clarity. And because they believe transformation belongs to the future, they delay action in the present. I'll start Monday. I'll change when life calms down. I'll become disciplined when I feel more motivated. I'll take action when I feel confident. That is the trap. Identity delay. The fantasy that one day you will magically become someone different without changing your repeated behavior today. That's the key. Transformation does not arrive first. Action does. You do not wake up one morning with discipline permanently installed into your personality. You build it, repetition by repetition, decision by decision, behavior by behavior. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Read that again carefully. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Not what you hope for. Not what you imagine. Not what you promise yourself during emotional moments. What you repeatedly enforce. That is why waiting is so dangerous. Because every delayed action quietly reinforces the current identity. Every time you say, I'll start later, you train postponement. Every time you avoid discomfort, you reinforce avoidance. Every time you wait for perfect emotional conditions, you strengthen emotional dependence. That pattern compounds over time. And eventually, delay itself becomes identity. You have a choice. Most people think confident people act because they already feel confident. No. Confident people became confident because they repeatedly acted under fear. That is how confidence is built. Not before action, through action. The same is true for discipline. Disciplined people were not born different. They trained consistency repeatedly until consistency became identity. That's the key. Identity is not discovered. Identity is constructed. Constructed through repeated behavior. Calm people train calm. Focused people train focus. Strong people train strength. And weak habits train weakness the exact same way. This is why your repeated behaviors matter more than your emotional intentions. Because repetition shapes the nervous system. What you repeatedly enforce becomes automatic over time. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Now think about how many people are trapped in fantasy transformation. They consume endless self-improvement content, watch motivational videos, read productivity advice, imagine future success constantly. But their daily behavior never changes consistently. That creates psychological conflict. Because the mind begins identifying with imagined progress instead of actual repetition. People feel productive without changing anything real. That's the key. Thinking about change is not the same as practicing change. Visualization without repetition changes very little. The nervous system learns through behavior, not fantasy. You have a choice. The next time you hear yourself saying, "I'll start when," stop immediately, because that sentence usually hides emotional avoidance. "I'll start when I feel ready." Translation: I want certainty before discomfort. "I'll start when motivation returns." Translation: I want emotion to carry me instead of discipline. "I'll start when conditions improve." Translation: I want transformation without resistance. But resistance is the process. Discomfort is the process. There is no version of transformation that removes difficulty completely. That is fantasy. Real change feels uncomfortable because it requires identity disruption. The old version of you resists the new behavior. That resistance is normal. Do not interpret resistance as a sign to stop. That's the key. Resistance often means growth is finally happening. Now let's talk about repetition more deeply. Because repetition is more powerful than motivation, personality, or temporary emotion. The brain adapts to what you repeatedly do. If you repeatedly avoid confrontation, confrontation feels more threatening over time. If you repeatedly act despite fear, fear loses authority over time. If you repeatedly wake up early, waking up early becomes easier over time. If you repeatedly practice focus, distraction loses strength over time. Identity follows repetition. Always. That is why small actions matter enormously. One disciplined action may not transform your life immediately, but repeated daily, it reshapes your identity completely. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Now understand something most people never realize. The version of you that you admire is built through standards, not moods. Disciplined people do not constantly negotiate with themselves emotionally. They establish expectations and repeatedly follow through. Not perfectly, consistently. That consistency changes self-perception. Because every kept promise strengthens identity internally. And every broken promise weakens trust in yourself. This is why self-respect is behavioral, not emotional. You do not build self-respect by thinking positively about yourself. You build it by becoming reliable to yourself. That's the key. The moment your behavior becomes aligned with your standards, identity begins changing automatically. Now think about calmness. People often believe calm individuals simply have a calm personality. No, calm is practiced. Calm people repeatedly train slower reactions, controlled breathing, Emotional regulation. Pause under pressure. That repetition became conditioning. The same is true for confidence. Confidence is not loud emotion. Confidence is evidence built through repeated action. Evidence that you can continue despite discomfort, despite fear, despite uncertainty. Every difficult action becomes proof, and proof reshapes identity. You have a choice. Right now, stop waiting to feel transformed before acting transformed. That mindset keeps people trapped for years. Instead, begin practicing the behaviors of the person you want to become today. Not emotionally, repeatedly. That repetition matters more than intensity. Anyone can feel motivated temporarily. Very few people can repeat disciplined behavior long enough for identity to change permanently. But permanent change only happens through repetition, not inspiration. That's the key. You do not become disciplined overnight. You become disciplined through daily enforcement. You do not become calm overnight. You become calm through repeated regulation under pressure. You do not become confident overnight. You become confident through repeated action under fear. Everything meaningful is trained. And every day you wait for some future version of yourself to appear magically, you strengthen the current version instead. That is why action matters now, not later. Now, one difficult action today matters more than endless future intentions. One completed task. One disciplined morning. One uncomfortable conversation. One moment where you continue despite resistance. Those moments build identity. Slowly, quietly, powerfully. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Remember this clearly. The future version of you is not coming to rescue you. You are building that person right now through repeated behavior. Every action votes for an identity. Every repetition strengthens a pattern. And eventually the repeated version wins. So stop waiting to become someone else someday. Start training that identity today. Not perfectly, deliberately. Because once you understand that identity is built through repeated action, the final lesson becomes unavoidable. How do you build a mind strong enough to remain stable under pressure no matter what life brings? Build a mind that does not collapse under pressure. Pressure reveals everything. Not your intentions. Not your goals. Not the version of yourself you imagine during comfortable moments. Pressure reveals your training. That's the key. Anyone can appear disciplined when life feels easy. Anyone can appear calm when nothing is being tested. Anyone can feel focused when emotions are stable. But pressure exposes the truth immediately. Stress reveals habits. Conflict reveals emotional control. Difficulty reveals identity. And if the mind has never been trained properly, pressure causes collapse. Emotional collapse. Mental collapse. Behavioral collapse. People panic. React impulsively. Abandon routines. Escape discomfort. Lose focus completely. Not because they are weak. Because the mind always returns to its deepest conditioning under pressure. That is why training matters so much. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. Read that again carefully. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. Everything in this audiobook has been preparing you for this final principle. The pause. Discipline. Emotional control. Calm. Identity. Discomfort training. These are not separate ideas. They are one system. A system designed to build internal stability when life becomes difficult. Because life will become difficult. That is guaranteed. unexpected stress, loss, failure, conflict, pressure, uncertainty. You cannot control whether difficulty arrives. You can control how trained your mind becomes before it does. You have a choice. Most people spend years trying to control external conditions instead of strengthening internal stability. They want life to become easier, less stressful, less uncertain. But external control is limited. Internal control is trainable. That's the key. A strong mind is not built by avoiding pressure. It is built by learning how to remain stable inside pressure. That changes everything. Because when pressure stops controlling your behavior, your entire relationship with life changes. You stop panicking every time discomfort appears. You stop collapsing every time emotions rise. You stop losing yourself every time uncertainty enters the room. The nervous system becomes stronger, and strength creates clarity. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. Now think about the pause. Everything begins there. Pressure enters. Emotion rises. The nervous system activates. Most people react automatically. But the trained mind pauses first. One breath, one interruption, one moment of awareness before reaction. That pause changes outcomes more than most people realize. Because panic depends on speed. Panic wants immediate reaction, immediate escape, immediate emotional discharge. But the pause interrupts panic before it takes control completely. That is power. Not loud power. Not aggressive power. Quiet power. The kind that remains grounded while chaos is trying to take over. You have a choice. Now think about discipline. Discipline is what remains after emotion disappears. And under pressure, emotion often disappears quickly. Motivation fades. Confidence fluctuates. Energy changes, but standards remain. That is why disciplined people appear emotionally stable more often. Not because they feel perfect internally, because behavior is no longer dependent on emotional comfort. That's the key. Pressure exposes emotional dependency immediately. If your routines only exist when emotions cooperate, pressure destroys consistency. But if your standards are stronger than your feelings, behavior survives stress. That is real discipline. Continuing despite internal resistance. Now think about emotional control. Most people fear pressure because pressure amplifies emotion. Stress becomes overwhelm. Fear becomes panic. Frustration becomes aggression. But emotional control changes the entire experience. The emotion still exists, but behavior no longer becomes enslaved to it. That distinction changes lives. A trained mind feels fear without surrendering direction, feels stress without collapsing into chaos, feels uncertainty without abandoning identity. That is emotional maturity, not emotional numbness. Leadership. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. Now think about calm. Calm is not passive. Calm is controlled energy. The ability to remain clear while pressure tries to create confusion. That clarity matters enormously. Because most destructive decisions happen during emotional escalation. Fast reactions. Impulsive behavior. Emotionally charged choices. Calm interrupts all of that. Slow breathing. Steady posture. Delayed speech. Controlled silence. These are not small things. These are nervous system training tools. And over time, repetition changes baseline emotional response. The mind learns. Pressure is survivable. Discomfort is manageable. Urgency does not require panic. That training compounds. Slowly, quietly, powerfully. You become harder to destabilize. That's the key. Now think about identity. Identity determines behavior under pressure more than motivation ever will. When pressure rises, people return to who they believe they are. If someone sees themselves as emotionally weak, they collapse faster. If someone sees themselves as disciplined, behavior stabilizes faster. Identity matters. And identity is trained through repetition. That is why all the small daily behaviors matter so much. Every difficult workout, every moment of emotional restraint, every completed task, every interrupted impulse, every pause before reaction. These moments are shaping identity constantly. You become what you repeatedly enforce. Eventually, the nervous system begins operating differently under stress because the training became automatic. That is transformation, not temporary inspiration. Conditioned stability. You have a choice. Now think about discomfort training. Most people spend their lives avoiding discomfort, then wonder why pressure destroys them emotionally. But discomfort tolerance is trainable. Every difficult action strengthens capacity. Cold environments, focused work, hard conversations, physical challenge, deliberate discipline. All of it trains the same thing. The ability to remain functional under stress. That is why discomfort matters so much. Not because suffering is the goal. Because discomfort expands emotional capacity. An expanded capacity changes how you experience life itself. Pressure stops feeling catastrophic. Difficulty stops feeling overwhelming. Resistance stops feeling like danger. The nervous system adapts. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. Now imagine the transformation this creates over time. You become less reactive. Not because emotions disappear. Because awareness interrupts reaction. You become more grounded. Not because life becomes predictable. Because your internal stability increases. You become emotionally stable. Not because pressure disappears. Because your nervous system learns regulation. You become focused under stress. Not because distractions vanish. Because discipline becomes stronger than impulse. You become consistent under pressure. Not because motivation stays constant. Because identity becomes stronger than emotion. That is the transformation. Quiet strength. Controlled energy. Deliberate behavior. Stable identity. The kind of strength most people never develop because they spend their entire lives reacting instead of training. But you are no longer reacting unconsciously. You are building awareness. Pause. Discipline. Calm. Self-command. And those qualities compound over time. That's the key. Remember this clearly. Your goal is not perfection. Perfection is fragile. Your goal is resilience. The ability to stay grounded while life becomes difficult. The ability to continue while emotions fluctuate. The ability to think clearly while pressure rises. That is real strength. And real strength is built through training. Not talent. Not personality. Training. A trained mind does not panic. It decides. So from this moment forward, stop asking, how do I avoid pressure? Start asking, how do I become stronger inside pressure? Because pressure is no longer your enemy. Pressure is revealing your level of training. And now you know how to train. You now understand something most people never realize for their entire lives. Your emotions were never the enemy. Your thoughts were never the problem. The problem was allowing them to lead without training, without awareness, without interruption. Every chapter of this audiobook gave you a piece of the same truth. The pause, discipline, discomfort, awareness, come, repetition, not as ideas, as tools. And now the real work begins. Not tomorrow morning, not when motivation returns, not when life becomes easier. The next time pressure rises, pause. The next time discomfort appears, continue. The next time your mind tells you to escape, stay present. Because every moment you refuse to obey weakness automatically, you are rebuilding your identity. A stronger mind is not born, it is trained. So here is your challenge. For the next 30 days, stop negotiating with the behaviors you know are destroying your future. No excuses, no emotional bargaining, no waiting to feel ready. Train daily, pause deliberately, act with discipline, and slowly, quietly, your mind will stop controlling you, because it will finally understand who is in charge.